What is the perfect soil mix to grow Agave Utahensis in? Of course, out in habitat, Agave Utahensis is famously limestone loving. It lives primarily in limestone soils. So do you need to be duplicating that in cultivation in your growing situation? What blend of inorganic to organic materials is ideal for growing Agave Utahensis, and which specific inorganic and which specific organic materials do you need to be using? And actually, most importantly, is that blend of organic and inorganic materials the right ratio for your specific climate and your specific growing conditions? That's what we're going to be talking about today, soil mixes for growing Agave Utahensis. So what is the ideal soil mix to grow Agave Utahensis in? That question is actually a little bit more complex. It's not super complex, but it's a little bit more complex and nuanced than it seems at first. And that basically boils down to where you live, where you're growing it, how you're growing it. We'll talk a little bit more towards the end of this video about how to make sure that you're using the proper soil mix for your specific environment. But first, to begin to understand what kind of soil mixes at all we should be using with Agave Utahensis, we should probably look at what kind of soil it grows in naturally in its habitat. So Agave Utahensis is a calcicole plant. Now what that means is that it primarily grows on limestone, in limestone-rich soils. In some places in habitat, and a lot of the places that you'll see online because it's really cool looking, that boils down to basically cracks in solid limestone faces, cliffs, and boulders. Now those are obviously very well draining areas, right? When water comes onto a solid limestone face, it goes into the crack, it might channel into that crack, might pull up in that crack for a little bit, but there's really nothing in that limestone for it to absorb into, and so it's naturally gonna drain out pretty fast. But in many, many areas where Agave Utahensis grows on limestone, it's actually growing in a type of soil called mollisoil. Now what mollisoil is basically a mixture of organic material that comes from plants that have grown and died in that same area, or leaves that have fallen off trees, pine needles that have fallen off trees, sticks and stuff that have fallen off trees, that compose quite a bit of organic material mixed in with what is essentially limestone gravel, right? So in many limestone-rich areas that Agave Utahensis grows in, it's not just growing in those cracks that you see online, it's actually growing in something called mollisoil. Now I've made a video about what's called the calcicole problem, that is understanding why Agave Utahensis loves to grow in limestone previously on the channel, but I think basically it boils down to the fact that limestone-rich environments are typically very well draining. Be it a crack in a limestone face or be it in limestone-based gravel, either way, those are very well draining substrates. And in fact, the reason that I say that is because in some parts of its range, Agave Utahensis actually doesn't grow on limestone, it grows on sandstone, but those sandstone environments are also very, very well draining. In fact, they're also typically just cracks in large sandstone faces, right? And so again, the reason that Agave Utahensis loves growing in limestone, I don't think there's anything magical about that limestone or the calcium that it donates or the alkalinity of the soil necessarily. In fact, I've been out with some friends recently who did some pH testing on the soils, and they found that many of the soils were actually neutral where Agave Utahensis was growing. But I think it's really about the fact that Agave Utahensis loves to grow in fast draining soils. So that's what we're gonna remember when we start to talk now about what kind of soil mixes we're gonna use in cultivation. So when we're planning a cultivation soil mix, there's two main categories of components that we can add to the mix. There's inorganic materials and then there's organic materials. So we'll start with the organic materials. Right now, organic is obviously something that used to be alive, is no longer alive. It decomposes, it breaks down, and it contributes often nutrients to a soil mix, stuff like nitrogen. It can also contribute micronutrients. It can contribute stuff like carbon to a soil mix. And typically, when you're talking about home growers, common sources of this are going to be stuff like peat moss or pine bark or worm castings, which is something that I use that's really interesting. We'll talk a little bit more about in a second, or even compost if you do some home composting, or if you can buy composting from an agricultural supply place. But I think the easiest thing for most folks to do when trying to figure out where they should get the organic material from for their potting soil mix is just to go to either like a big box store, or if you have a small independent garden shop around, and purchase their, their cactus mix, their, store-made cactus, or even sometimes citrus mix, because these will be high organic material soil mixes that are still made to be fast draining. They'll probably contain little white balls, which is perlite, but most of the mix is gonna be stuff like peat and pine bark and stuff like that. So in my soil mix, I actually use quite a bit of store-bought cactus mix, something like 20%, 25% roughly in my mix of just a big bag of big box store soil mix of cactus or citrus soil mix. And then there, another, as I said, another kind of organic material that I really love using in my soil mix for Agave Utahensis is actually something called worm castings, which is the output of a worm that's been eating through something like compost, right? It's super organic, it's super dark and rich and fertile, has a lot of nutrients, micronutrients in it, and specifically can actually contribute a significant amount of nitrogen to your soil mix. Now, a lot of folks who grow cactuses and succulents are sometimes afraid of nitrogen because they believe that fertilizing or adding too much nitrogen to your plants will result in them not having a hard grown form, or will somehow make their form, that is their shape, their color, their something, not look super cool. Now, of course, there are studies done on other forms of agave that the more nitrogen you give agave, the faster it will grow. But then also from my experience growing, Agave Utahensis as an ornamental plant, seeking to try to get the Agave Utahensis to look as cool as possible, I've done experiments where I don't fertilize very much and I over fertilize, or I use worm castings, or I don't use worm casings, all that sort of stuff. And I can tell you that using nitrogen, fertilizing your plant, giving it access to nitrogen, be it in the form of synthetic fertilizer or in the form of organic worm casings, does not negatively impact its form. In fact, I think I've grown some really cool Agave Utahensis plants in some pretty high nutrient situations. So don't be afraid of a little nitrogen in your soil mix in the form of worm casing. So in my particular soil mix, like I said, I use about 20, 25%, somewhere in that range of store-bought cactus mix. It's something like 20, 25%, about even amount of worm casings. Worm casings are a bit more expensive than store-bought cactus mix, and they're also really, really fine, right? Like it's a much finer particle. A store-bought cactus mix is gonna have some, wood chips in it and some bigger chunks in it, and those bigger chunks will help to make it be a bit more well-draining, right? It won't compact as much, which is why I actually use both of them. The other important thing to consider about organic material versus inorganic material, which we're going to talk about next, is the fact that organic material retains water for a much longer period of time. It stays wet for way longer than inorganic material does. And if you want to see that in action, get 2 pots with drainage holes in the bottom of them, fill one with lava rocks or any other kind of rocks, pour a bunch of water in it and set it out, and then get another pot with drainage holes in it, pour a bunch of soil mix in it, organic soil mix in it, potting mix, and pour a bunch of water in it and set that out and see which one is dry. Come back a day later, 2 days later, 3 days later, and see which one's is still wetter, which one's still retaining moisture. And you're gonna probably not be surprised, but the potting soil mix is gonna stay wet for a much longer period of time. Agave Utahensis, as we said, in habitat prefers well-draining substrates. It prefers well-draining areas, so that well-draining characteristic is what's most important. And to achieve that, we go from the organic components of your soil mix to now let's talk about the inorganic components of your soil mix. So inorganic components of the soil mix are typically stuff that's made from rock or clay, something that didn't used to be alive and is now decaying, stuff that generally doesn't break down and that doesn't contribute a whole lot of, it might contribute some sort of trace micronutrients like calcium or things like that, minerals, but it probably is not contributing a whole lot of macronutrients, things like nitrogen, to your soil mix. What it's doing is helping you balance the water retention of your soil mix. So common components of the inorganic side of a soil mix, these are the things that I use are, lava rocks, which you can get online, you can get at a store, you can get at Amazon, perlite, which is like that white ball stuff, or turfus. Those are the 3 primary inorganic materials that I use. Lava rocks are really heavy, they're super cool looking though, they don't really retain water at all, but they will make sure that your soil mix is very fast draining. Turfus is similar. Turfus it looks like a rock, it's actually made from clay. and it's fired clay essentially. So it doesn't really break down in the same way like a bonsai, like an akadama bonsai clay breaks down. But turfus will retain water. It'll hold on to water for a bit longer than many other inorganic materials, which is one of the main reasons I use it. And then perlite. Now, perlite is much lighter than the other two. It's actually sort of a fiberglass-based product, so you should probably wear a face mask when you're dealing with it. I know we probably all got a bunch of extra face masks lying around the house. I know I do. So whenever I'm doing some potting with perlite, I wear a mask because it's not great to be breathing in a whole lot of that stuff. But basically, it's super light. It's very well draining, and it doesn't hold on to water very, very much, right? There are other, of course, inorganic materials you can use for the inorganic side of your soil mix. Very common ones are things like pumice. Another thing that some folks will add is called crushed limestone. Now, because Agave Utahensis, as we said before, is a calcicole, it loves limestone-rich soils. A lot of folks will use crushed limestone to try to emulate that environment a bit better. Now, as I said before, I don't think that the reason that Agave Utahensis is limestone loving is necessarily because of the things that limestone brings to the equation in terms of minerals or alkalinity. Rather, it's just because it's really well draining. I don't think that said, I don't think there's anything wrong with using crushed limestone in your mix other than the fact that it's kind of expensive when compared to stuff like lava rocks or turfus or perlite. And then it's also really, really heavy, right? So it's got really small particle size and it's pretty heavy. So if your soil mix is like got a lot of crushed limestone in it, eventually, especially if you're using bigger pots, if you have bigger plants, they're going to get kind of heavy after a while. But again, if you want to include some crushed limestone or even crushed eggshells, which are another source of calcium, go ahead and do that. A lot of times you can find those kind of products at like agricultural supply stores because they're used to add calcium to the diets of livestock in some cases. So as I said, the main job of the inorganic material in your soil mix is to ensure that that soil mix is well draining. And as we talked about with the organic materials, particle size has a lot to do with that. Worm casings are really, really fine particles. And so when they get wet, you can ball them up and squeeze them. They're gonna make balls, right? So they're not gonna be very well draining. The water's not just gonna run through them. Store-bought cactus mix, while it's organic and it will absorb and retain water, generally has larger chunks, things like wood chips and things like that in it, that are gonna make it a bit more well draining. But primarily, we're gonna be relying on those inorganic components to ensure that your soil mix is well draining. And a lot of that boils down to like I said, some inorganic materials like turfus will hold on to water, but nowhere near the level that an organic material will. The other thing to think about is gonna be the particle size. So when you're buying an inorganic material, you're gonna be able to buy it in different particle sizes. You know, perlite is generally pretty small particles, obviously not as small as worm casings, but it's a pretty small particle size. When it comes to lava rocks, you can get lava rocks, people use them for their fire pits outdoors. So you can get really big, inch long, inch and a half long lava rocks, big bags of it, or you can get much smaller, much finer lava rocks. Generally speaking, I would probably aim in terms of lava rocks on the smaller side, right? Because you don't want big giant chunks. If your plant is just on a chunk of lava rock, that's probably not the best thing. It's only really getting exposed to that lava rock and not to the rest of the stuff that's in your soil mix. And the same thing goes for turfus or pumice or whatever else you're using, is that you kind of want to look for reasonably small sized particles and then make sure your soil mix is really well mixed, well blended, such that when the plant is growing, it's not just sort of, particularly if you're growing from seed, that plant isn't just growing off of one giant chunk of lava rock or pumice or whatever it is. On the flip side of that, for instance, some sources of turfus will include, some dust and some really, really fine particles. You probably want to stay away from using too much of that because, again, that's going to act a bit more like that worm casings material that I talked about, where if you get it wet and you ball it up, it's just going to kind of become one big clump and it's not going to be very well draining. But generally speaking, we add the organic materials for their inclusion of nutrients, macro and micro, and their ability to retain water. And we add the inorganic materials for their ability to ensure that that soil mix is well draining. And then some folks will add stuff like crushed limestone to bring in some micronutrients. So the question then becomes what amount of each to use, right? That is pretty personal, that's pretty specific to your specific area, and we'll talk about that more next. But generally speaking, you kind of want to start that thinking around a 50-50% ratio for Agave Utahensis, okay? Because Agave Utahensis will rot. It does like well-draining soil conditions. We don't want to let its feet stay wet, let it stay sitting and standing, wet dirt basically. But we also do want to make sure that it's got water, enough availability of water in the soil mix for a long enough period of time for the roots to take it up and to use it. Because again, there's been studies shown that the more on other forms of agave, but the more water you give agave, the more well irrigated you treat the agave, the faster it will grow. And I've talked about this in my watering video, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that again, like I said, next. But basically start that discussion, start thinking about that at about 50-50. Now, I live here in the desert. I use a ton of fans, so I use 50-50. I could actually probably get away with a bit more organic material, a bit more water retaining organic material, but I also use quite a bit of turfus in my mix, which will retain water or hold on to water as well. Because again, the desert where I live and all the fans that I have, my plants, my soil, my potting mix dries out very, very fast. So that's the question then, is not necessarily what's the perfect for everybody's soil mix for Agave Utahensis, but it's what's the perfect soil mix for your situation, for where you live. So if you live in the desert and you use a whole bunch of fans, and go ahead and just do 50-50, blend up whatever amount of organic materials you want, whatever amount of inorganic materials you want, add them in equal parts to your soil mix. Simple. But if you live somewhere else, or you're not using a ton of fans, like say you live in coastal California, a lot of growers who grow cactuses in that area where it's fairly humid will use 100% inorganic materials, right? I don't think that's necessarily necessary for Agave Utahensis. I think even in humid conditions, you could probably still use 10, 20, 30% organic materials. But again, that boils down to what your specific conditions are like. So do you live in a humid area? Are you growing indoors with a lot of, artificial air conditioning and heating? Or are you using a lot of fans? What's your relative humidity inside? What's your relative temperature inside? How fast is your soil mix going to dry out? And the best way to answer that, now you could just sort of rule of thumb and go, okay, I live in the desert, it's pretty dry here, I'll use 50-50. Or I live somewhere humid, coastal California, maybe somewhere, more inland where it's inland in the United States where it's more humid. So I'll use 30% organic material and 70% inorganic material just to make sure that my soil mixes dry out. That's probably gonna work pretty well for most viewers. But if you're a big nerd like me and you want to take it a step further, I urge you to go check out my watering video, because in my watering video, I explain a process by which I water and weigh plants. I measure how much they weigh before and after watering, and then after they have spent some time drying out, to determine what my drying rate is. Because if you can measure the drying rate in your specific climate, in your humidity or your dryness, or in your fan, your airflow situation, you can determine, okay, my plants, these size pots that I'm using in this environment, in this temperature, they're drying out, in a day, and I don't want to be watering every single day. So in my mix, I'm going to add more organic materials that'll hold on to water for a longer period of time. Or you might find out after doing this, like, wow, I thought I was in a pretty dry environment, but it turns out, maybe it's the airflow in where I'm growing, or, the soil mix, or whatever it is, that there's a lot of water left in these pots after a week. Like the bottom of the soil is still wet. They don't, weigh as fully dry plants. And so, okay, next time I make up a soil mix, I'm gonna add a lot more inorganic materials. So again, the ideal soil mix for Agave Utahensis, you can either just go by the sort of easy rule of thumb. If you're in a desert, if you're somewhere where it's dry, 50-50 organic, inorganic. If you're somewhere where it's more humid, maybe go 70-30, 70% inorganic, 30% organic material. But if you want to be really nerdy, and I super suggest you do this, because it's not very hard, and my watering video, like I said, details how to do it. Super easy. You get to play with Excel, which is always super cool. Is weigh your plants, figure out what your drying rate is, and then sort of modulate the soil mix to your specific conditions. And again, I don't think that there is anything specifically magical about adding limestone, crushed in the form of crushed limestone, to your plants, to your soil mix. I don't think you need to go that far to emulate the calcicoal, the limestone-rich environments that Agave Utahensis grows in habitat, because I think really the key thing about where it's growing in habitat is that it's very, very well draining. And in fact, if you want to add more calcium, more minerals, more micronutrients to your plants, there are a bunch of supplements that you can use to do that. Synthetic fertilizers, there's probably some organic ways to do that. Like I said, crushed eggshells are probably a pretty good way to do that as well. But generally speaking, like I said, refer back to that watering video, measure your plants out, and then come back here and figure out what percentage of various organic compounds you can find, and which specific, which percentage of worm casings versus store-bought cactus mix, or what percentage of pumice or turfus or lava rocks. A lot of that is also going to determine, because a lot of this stuff is really heavy, so shipping costs will vary depending on where you are in the country. So I would visit your local store and kind of see what they have available, what the prices are. In your area, you might find that pumice is really inexpensive and very available to you there. It's not very available for me here, so I don't use a lot of it. On the other hand, turfus, lava rock, perlite, all that kind of stuff is very affordable and quite available here where I am. So that's where I use quite a bit of that. So again, a lot of this boils down to where you are, but I hope this video gave you some good rules of thumb, some good places to start when determining what the right soil mix is for Agave Utahensis. And I would love to hear more from you down in the comments. What are you using? What's your soil mix like for your agave plants? Thanks for watching.